And I said maybe, knowing I wouldn't, because their study sessions were mostly conducted in Chapalish now. The whole lunch period felt like I was making everyone work harder just by being there, like my presence was this annoying reminder that not everyone had bought into the program. That afternoon, I started a symptom journal in a new section of my notebook. I wrote down the date and time, then described the headache I'd had since yesterday, rating it 7 out of 10 for intensity. I documented the mental fog I felt whenever I tried to think in Chapelish, how it was like pushing through something thick and resistant. I wrote about the weird cognitive snap during drills last week, when the grammar suddenly made sense, but in a way that felt wrong, like my brain was rewired without my permission. If something was actually affecting me differently than other students, I wanted a record of when it started and how it was getting worse. I noted that the symptoms began around the time advanced Chapelish was introduced and seemed to get worse after each class. Other kids weren't reporting headaches or fog. They were saying Chapelish made thinking clearer, so either I was having some kind of adverse reaction or I was resisting hard enough that my brain was fighting back. I pulled out my phone and opened my email, composing a message to 3 linguistics professors at nearby universities whose contact information I'd found on department websites. I kept the email professional but detailed, explaining that my school was teaching a language called Chapelish that didn't exist in any database or reference material. I could find. I attached photos of the 37-character alphabet and examples of the grammar structure, asking if they recognized any patterns or could identify what language family it might belong to. I mentioned that 17 schools across different states started teaching this simultaneously, all on the same Monday morning, with no explanation of its origins. I said I was trying to understand where this language came from and whether it was normal for schools to teach something with no documented history or academic foundation. I read the email 3 times before sending it, making sure I sounded curious rather than crazy, then hit send to all 3 professors and hoped at least one would respond with something useful. By Thursday morning, I had responses from 2 of the professors sitting in my inbox. The first one was polite, but basically useless, saying he'd never encountered anything like the symbols I'd sent and suggesting it might be a constructed language created for educational purposes. He mentioned that artificial languages like Esperanto exist for specific reasons, and maybe Chapelish was something similar. The second professor's response was longer and more technical, analyzing the grammar patterns I'd described and noting they didn't match any known language family. She said the structure was interesting from a linguistic perspective, but couldn't explain why 17 schools would simultaneously teach something that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. Both professors were professional and tried to be helpful, but neither could answer my actual questions about where this came from or who decided we should learn it. I forwarded both responses to my phone and saved them in a folder with all my other documentation, adding 2 more pieces of evidence that confirmed what I already knew. This language appeared out of nowhere, and nobody outside our schools had any record of it existing. Friday morning, I went to the nurse's office before first period complaining about eye strain and persistent headaches. The nurse was this older woman who'd been at the school forever and she had me sit on the examination table while she checked my vision with one of those eye chart tests. I told her the headaches started when we began advanced chapelish and got worse after each class, that the symbols hurt to look at for too long. She asked about my screen time and how much sleep I was getting, whether I was drinking enough water and taking breaks from homework. I said yes to all of it, but she didn't seem interested in the connection to chapelish, just kept asking standard questions about dehydration and stress. She gave me a vision test and said my eyes were fine, then told me to drink more water and get 8 hours of sleep, and the headaches would probably go away. I left with a pass back to class, feeling like she'd completely dismissed the one thing I was actually concerned about, treating my symptoms like they had nothing to do with the new class, even though the timing was obvious. Saturday afternoon, I walked through the empty school building with my phone out taking photos. My mom worked in the district office and had gotten me access through the weekend security guard, saying I needed to grab something from my locker. Instead, I went through every hallway photographing the chapelish signage that had appeared over the past month. Vocabulary posters in the main hallway showing common phrases with translations, grammar reminders on bulletin boards near the cafeteria. Even the gym had a poster explaining sports terminology in chapelish, words for basic movements and equipment that had nothing to do with second-period language class. What started as one class had spread into every corner of the school, like some kind of infection. I took photos of everything, documenting how this language had invaded spaces that had nothing to do with the actual course. The library had a whole shelf of chapelish materials now, workbooks and readers and reference guides. The student center had conversation tables where kids could practice speaking it during lunch. It wasn't just a class anymore. It was becoming part of the school's entire identity. Monday morning, the principal held a Q&A session in the auditorium about school initiatives and new programs. I showed up early to make sure I got a seat where I could raise my hand, sitting in the middle section with a clear view of the microphone they'd set up for questions. The principal talked for 20 minutes about test scores and college acceptance rates and innovative approaches to education. When he opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand immediately, and he called on me third. I walked to the microphone and asked where chapelish came from, who approved adding it to our curriculum, and why 17 schools across different states all started teaching it on the same day. The auditorium got quiet, and I could feel people staring at me, but I kept my eyes on the principal waiting for an answer. He smiled and launched into scripted talking points about innovative pilot programs and future-ready skills, how chapelish was preparing students for a changing world and giving them advantages in college admissions. He said the program had been carefully designed by education experts and was implemented with full support from the administration. I asked again who specifically approved it and when, but he just repeated the same phrases about pilot programs and innovative approaches, never actually answering where the language came from or who made the decision to teach it. Other students asked questions about sports schedules and parking passes, and the moment passed, leaving me standing at the microphone, knowing I hadn't gotten any real answers at all. That afternoon, I texted Alex asking if we could hang out like we used to, just the two of us without the whole group. He said sure, and we met at the coffee shop near school, where we'd spent hundreds of afternoons over the past 3 years. He showed up 15 minutes late and immediately pulled out his phone, checking messages while I tried to talk about the Q&A session and how the principal dodged every real question. Alex nodded but kept glancing at his screen, and I realized he was in 3 different group chats planning chapelish study sessions for the week. He seemed annoyed when I asked about it, saying I wouldn't understand because I wasn't keeping up with the class material anymore. We sat there for 40 minutes, and he spent at least half that time responding to messages, his attention divided between our conversation and whatever was happening in those study groups. When I brought up my concerns about the program, he sighed and said I was making everything harder by fighting, instead of just learning, and maybe if I put this much energy into actually studying, I'd be fluent by now. We left, without making plans to hang out again. Tuesday evening, my mom dragged me to a PTA meeting where the administration was presenting updates on the school programs. The principal and 2 teachers stood at the front with a slideshow about chapelish as a future-proof skill that would give students advantages in college admissions and standardized testing. They talked about how the program was preparing kids for a changing world and how universities were starting to recognize chapelish proficiency on applications, which made no sense because the language existed nowhere except these 17 schools. Parents asked practical questions about workload and whether the extra studying would affect performance in other classes, and several wanted to know how grades would be calculated and if there were tutoring options available. Nobody challenged the basic premise of teaching a language that had appeared from nowhere 3 months ago. Nobody asked where it came from, or who approved adding it to the curriculum, or why their kids were learning something that couldn't be used anywhere outside these specific classrooms. The administration answered every practical concern with detailed explanations while completely avoiding the fundamental weirdness of the entire situation. Wednesday in class, I finished my worksheet early and glanced at the sample assessment questions the teacher had posted on the board for next week's test. Every question was a controlled response prompt with limited vocabulary options, like fill in the blank or choose the correct grammatical structure from 3 possibilities. The test wasn't measuring whether we could actually communicate ideas or understand cultural context the way normal language exams did. It was just checking if we could produce specific predetermined responses using exact grammatical structures we'd been drilled on. There were no open-ended questions, no writing prompts asking us to express original thoughts, no listening comprehension that required interpreting meaning from context, just pattern recognition and memorized responses, like we were being trained to operate within a very narrow set of linguistic rules rather than learning an actual living language. Thursday after class, I stayed behind during the teacher's office hours, waiting until the other students left before approaching her desk. I asked directly why she kept telling me to stop resisting instead of addressing my questions about where this language came from and what we were really learning it for. She looked tired and stressed, rubbing her temples like she had a headache, and she said I needed to focus on fluency because my grades were suffering. She warned me that I was spending all my energy fighting the program instead of just learning the material, and at this rate, I was going to fail the class. even though I clearly had the ability to succeed if I would just stop making everything so difficult. I asked again about the origins, and she cut me off, saying she couldn't discuss those details, and I needed to trust that the administration knew what they were doing. Her hands shook slightly as she gathered papers from her desk, and she wouldn't make eye contact, and I realized she was as trapped in this situation as I was, following orders she didn't fully understand or agree with. That weekend, I forced myself to do the chapelish drills from the workbook, spending 2 hours on Saturday afternoon working through vocabulary exercises and grammar patterns. I needed to pass this class even if I didn't understand what it was really for, and the drills were supposed to help with fluency. About an hour in, something weird happened where the grammar suddenly clicked in a way that felt completely wrong. It was like my brain just accepted these patterns without questioning them anymore, the symbols and structures making sense in a way that felt too easy and too fast. I could form sentences without thinking about the rules, the language flowing naturally, even though I'd been struggling with it for weeks. The ease of it scared me more than the